So my discussant, unfortunately, can't be here. She had some very excellent points that I'm sure you guys might raise as well. So I don't know if we're going to, I could do my own discussion. I'm not sure.
I'm going to put up her slides and just say what they are.
Okay, for sure. Okay, cool. All right, so I guess in terms of interruption, if we do the interruption, I'm okay with interruptions, but that just might mean we extend time and not have a discussion period after. How do you?
Nope, going to cut you off at 10.
Okay, then feel free to interrupt, but I might just reserve your question to the end depending on the time. Okay, so very excited to be here and get your feedback. So this is a really early phase, I guess, part of a larger project with Randall Leakey at UCLA. So what I'm going to do in this talk right now is essentially give you a bunch of predominantly descriptive statistics and to set up a issue or a problem we're going to be looking at a little bit more in depth. That's, again, part of a bigger scheme that I'll talk about a bit later. All right, so the motivation for this paper, the title, Missing Women, Gender Ratios, and First Nations Communities. So the original motivation for this paper actually came out of a lot of the Canadian news on missing Indigenous women, mostly missing from suspicions of foul play, et cetera. But we took a step back and thought, okay, well, there's already a massive literature in economics on biased sex ratios more generally. I had started almost 30 years ago with Amartya Sen looking at sex ratios in a lot of developing countries. And most of the discussion is focused on countries like China and India and missing girls and women at early phases of life, like around birth or before birth. Now, recent work has also shown the presence of missing women in immigrant populations in both Canada and the US, okay? Where there seems to be a cultural preference for sons that continues independent of just economic factors surrounding a family. Now, what Andy and I are going to do with this paper is we're going to take a look at First Nations communities and essentially compute the sex ratio in First Nations communities and see what the patterns are there. Okay? This is the first paper we're aware of that systematically documents gender ratios or sex ratios in First Nations communities. We're going to do it for 2001, 2006, and 2011. And then after we do this, we're going to go through what sort of explanations are consistent for the skew we observe in the data. Now again, all of this is going to be very much setting up the problem, doing just some averages and descriptives, but we'll talk a little bit more about what I think the economic factors are that are driving this. So a lot of you will have some instant thoughts about it, so please be patient. Hopefully we'll cover all of them. Okay, what I'm going to do this is I'm going to start by using the census community profiles for 2001, 2006, and 2011. These are repeated cross-sections, so it just takes individual data and aggregates it up to the community level, and you observe the same communities over time. Not all the same, admittedly. So it includes all Canadian communities over 40 people with enumeration rates, so how much of the population you counted, over 25% in 2001 and 2006, and over 50% in 2011. Okay. These files were created from the census, the short form, which is just counting, are you a man, are you a woman in this household, how many people are in this household, and also from the long form censuses, which are these long documents that some households are required to fill out, and from the National Household Survey in 2011, which replaced the long form census. And communities are defined as municipalities or the equivalents of municipal municipalities, like essentially political units around a region. So Indian reserves, for example, would be considered a community, right? Or a village or a small town of a similar size to Indigenous community. To give you a sense, the 2001 and 2006 census were very similar, and same with the long form. The long form was mandatory to fill out for 2001 to 2006. It became voluntary in 2011 with the National Household Survey, which replaced it. The percentage of the population that received the long form census on reserve and in other isolated or rural communities was 100% of the population. And the same was true for 2011. Now, most communities were only surveyed at the rate of 20% for 2001, 2006, and in 2011 it was 33%, a bit higher. Response rates were very high for the mandatory census. However, they were a bit lower for the National Household Survey. So I'm not going to use much of the variables that are included in the National Household Survey with what I'll show you today, but I have used a lot of them in other things we've done that I can talk to you about if you ask questions regarding them. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at all communities in Canada, but I'm going to drop communities with less than 120 people. I'm going to be looking at gender ratios by age group, and if I look at too small of an age group and too small of a community, I end up with 0 in the denominator of some of my ratios, and I obviously don't want that. So I'm going to focus on bigger communities. Okay? This means I drop about 9% of First Nations communities and 1% of non-First Nations communities. Yeah?
The reporting rate on in Aboriginal communities is closer to 80%. You've got better results for Aboriginal CSDs than for non-Aboriginal CSDs.
Yes. That is, yes. Okay, thank you. Yes, great. Yes, yes, that is a good thing, I think. Yes. So thank you. Yes, for pointing that out. Also, I'm only going to include communities in my data that are present in all census years. So not all Indigenous communities were enumerated consistently over these 3 waves of the survey, right? So I'm going to exclude them. In total, this ends up being, since different reserves participated and didn't participate, a little like 35 communities or so are excluded, okay? So on total, I have a little over 1,000 reserve communities for the 3 years, so that only comes out to about 350, almost 400 for each year. This is about 60% of the total number possible. So again, keep in mind, I'm looking at a selected set of Indigenous communities. If I go to the microdata and take a brief look to see if my results change, whether include everyone, so right now I just got access to the microdata to do a different part of this project, but everything I'm going to tell you today holds up, and if anything, the differences are magnified, okay? Now, another thing that I wanted to bring up, because I think it's just important to understand, is that the public census counts are randomly rounded if the population size is greater than 10, either up or down, right? So like I said, this results in an observation of 0 for some communities that end up being dropped because they get rounded down, right? If there's 1 person, it counts as a 0. Now, I am looking at ratios, and I have random rounding on the numerator and denominator in these cells, so I'm going to say that it cancels out. It's going to mess up my standard errors a little bit, but if I bootstrap confidence intervals, everything goes through and it's fine. Again, nothing gets eliminated by this alone. Okay, so right here, this is just the first set of summary statistics where I take the male-female gender ratio, so the number of men in a First Nations community or in a non-First Nations community or in a large city, and put that over the number of women. So this is a commonly calculated statistic in the missing women's literature that exists already in economics. So here, First Nations communities in general, those on reserve, have a gender ratio above 1, about 1.02. Okay? Cities near First Nations have about an average of 0.957 or something, and Canadian communities on average have a little bit higher than that, right? So a gender ratio far below 1. So we see in First Nations communities, you have a gender ratio highly skewed toward men. Okay? Now to put this into context, I have just a figure here that takes a bunch of international gender ratios. On this side is a bunch of OECD countries. Here's Canada. Here's the First Nation communities gender ratio, and a set of communities that is not OCD. Okay? Oh, OCED. Yeah, so acronyms. So basically the point of this slide is that First Nations communities have gender ratios that are more skewed as they look more like developing nations gender ratios than they do developed nation gender ratios. Now, I haven't included India and China on this graph. India and China would be at about 1.08 is India and 1.06 is China. Okay, so it just would have extended things a little bit. Now the question is, okay, why? Is this a red herring? What's going on here? So there's several very simple explanations, and I'm sure more, but I'll talk about these 3 potential ones. The first is differences in the age distribution. It's already been brought up, the First Nations population is far younger, and actually men are born at a slightly higher rate than women are born, right? So just naturally, if everyone was age 0, we would expect there to be more men than women, and since First Nations are younger, we expect there to be more men. Okay? Also, men die more likely to die earlier. So this is why you see a gender ratio less than 1 in the community in general. Second possibility is gender bias in the legislation over who can be on reserve, okay, or who's counted as a status Indian. So in Canada, we have something called a registered Indian status. So I don't believe there's something equivalent in the US, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially you need to register with, or the government counts you as a Indian under certain conditions, okay? And this has changed over time. In 1951, there was a change in the legislation that essentially made it such that if a woman outmarried, so if an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, they lost their status, and they could no longer be part of their band, and they could not reside in First Nations communities or reserves anymore, okay? That was revised in 1985. So women who had lost their status previously by marrying out could regain their status under this new legislation. But there was something called the double grandmother clause, where people who had two parents who had outmarried who were women also lost their status. Okay, so this continued to have a gender bias aspect to the legislation, which is again attempted to be corrected in 2010 with Bill C-3. Okay, so it's another possibility. Maybe this gender bias legislation made women just have to leave the reserve because they lost their status because they outmarried. Well, men wouldn't have lost their status if they had outmarried, and they could reside on reserve still. And the final possibility is differential migration. So there's a lot of subcategories to differential migration, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But let's just start off to see, okay, what might be driving this?
Counting marriage as migration, so marriage and then leaving the reserve, that would be counting as migration.
If you marry and then leave, that's out migration, versus like married and you stay, then that's not migration. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Okay. Oh, and I should be clear, because this came up in the last talk too. I just showed you First Nations communities, and obviously there are some First Nations communities that have a whole chunk of white people in them. I can do this again, just counting Indigenous people only, and the same thing holds up. If anything, again, the skew is more dramatic. Okay? That's with the exception of some communities in the north, it doesn't hold up as well, but generally somewhere else it does. All right, first, differences in the age distribution, okay? So what I've done here to try to get a sense of, okay, where do these gender differentials start, right? Or do they look the same and it's just differences in the age distribution that cause these skews? So here is from the 0 to 14 age category, 15 to 19, 20 to 24, 25 to 44, and 45 to 65, okay? And a nearest service center is essentially the nearest city close to a reserve. I could have used nearest town, or just nearest community more generally, or just any Canadian community, and this sort of pattern would have persisted, okay? First Nations communities are in red, and service centers are in blue. So first, from the 0, and I also chose these age categories because I had them in all 3 waves of the census. Okay, or the community surveys. First thing to point out is the 0 to 14 age category are virtually identical, right? So people are born or reside on reserve at the same rates as they would in a non-Indigenous community. So these skewed sex ratios we see in China and India that occur at birth aren't what's happening here. This is not the story of sex selection or anything in these communities, okay? But from the age 15 to 19, we see all of a sudden a massive gap emerge in the sex ratio. Right? And that gap persists all the way to 40 to 65, and if I were to show greater than 65, it would still be dramatic. Okay? And we can see that this is consistent for all years of the census. Right? So in 2001, it's a little bit less dramatic, but we can see it consistently for 2006 and 2011 as well. Okay? So this is not being driven by any particular year. It kind of looks like the gap at the 15 to 19 age range gets larger. It isn't statistically any different. It looks that way, but it's not. It may be when my data are more precise, like when I don't have the rounding issue, which makes my errors bigger. And that I can do when I have the confidential data, which should be any day now. Okay. All right, gender bias legislation. You guys probably don't know what, maybe some of you know what Section 11 is of the Indian Act, but many of you probably don't. So, like I had said previously, for a long time, Indian status was conferred by the federal government, and there were certain criteria you needed to be included as a registered Indian, all right, to not lose your status. In '85, the amendment to the Indian Act allowed bands or First Nations communities to opt out of the band membership rules of the Indian Act, okay? They could just be like, we don't like your ways of counting us, let's count ourselves, right? And they opt out of what's called Section 11 and go into Section 10, or they come under a self-governance agreement, which helps them determine their own band membership rules, okay? So what these are gender ratios and their standard errors, and this is for a Section 11 band, and this is not a Section 11 band. So that means someone who either is under Section 10, determining their own band rules, or have some sort of governance agreement, okay? The first thing to note is from 0 to 19, again, I had to condense this because I lose information if I don't. Like lose observations if I don't. But between 0 to 19, it's about the same for Section 11 or not a Section 11 ban. So that early difference in the gender ratio isn't being driven by gender bias legislation or previously gender bias legislation. However, we can see from the 20 to 64 range, there is a difference, and that difference is statistically significant no matter what I condition on, right? So I can condition on region, year, a whole bunch of economic characteristics, and that's still going to be present and is basically unaffected by these other things, okay? From over 65, the difference is very large, okay, on reserve. So we see here that for those over 65, the gender bias legislation that previously existed actually could still be causing people not to return to the reserve. Okay? So it's part of the story. That's what's going on is gender bias in the Indian Act. However, it's certainly not the full story, at least for those in the younger age categories. Yeah,
Can I-
of course.
I mean, part of, if you look at sex ratios in other communities,
Mhm.
we're losing men over time
Mhm.
because men die out.
Exactly, yeah.
Too bad, guys. So in a sense, you're actually, like, either for some reason on reserve men don't die out,
Yeah,
or we're actually underestimating the effect because,
yes,
you know.
yeah.
But here, if you think about that, the not Section 11 bans are usually, they probably are a lot, like overall, they're better,
Yes,
better well off.
they
they're
are,
well off, right?
yeah.
And so you could see some of that health effect, like what you're picking up here.
Yeah.
That be some of the men, like, men that are generally,
Yeah.
well-to-do, they eventually die out because they have early heart attacks or strokes or something
Okay.
like this.
Oh, I mean, that's feasible, right? However, when I condition on the economic characteristics I have, it doesn't change anything. But that assumes that I'm picking up something about health on reserve, and I don't know if I'm getting that. Again, when I have the microdata, I also have the year of implementation of when these switch, so it's not going to be perfect, right? Because again, these bans are generally better to do, et cetera. But we're going to get to actually min dying out in a second because this is actually connected. No, but this is it's a great question and great point. Okay. So the next question is, okay, well, there's this third option, obviously, differential migration. It's not like we're in an entire country, right? A lot of reserves are right next to a city, right? So people can leave. And it's possible that men and women want to leave the community at different times for different reasons, or opportunities differ, okay? So get a sense of this. Here again are the gender ratios for, on total, so just for all, I guess, ethnicities, right, or definitions. And this is for First Nations single ancestry, so I have only identified as a First Nations if I were to list all my possible ethnic backgrounds. Here, I only claim that I am First Nations and nothing else is how I identify. This is separate from my ancestry. If you want to talk about the details, we can, but the results are similar enough. It's not a big deal. Well, maybe it is, depending on what you do and what you think about. But registered Indian or treaty Indian, we see, however, there's a pretty big difference. So on reserve, we see that gender ratio over 1. But when we start talking about service centers or rural towns, the gender ratio in rural towns looks pretty normal. But then when you get to service centers, it's very low and skewed highly in favor of women. Actually, some towns, I've talked to a couple people at the First People's House, just at U of Ek, and there's these kind of indigenous women's cities, or how people think about them, like Winnipeg, Saskatoon. If you look at Saskatoon or Winnipeg, the gender ratio is closer to like 0.8 or 0.79 or something. You have a huge proportion of First Nations women, registered Indians, in these cities and not on reserve. And in fact, if you actually look at, so here's Canada, here's a First Nations community, but this is the First Nations population overall. If anything, we're missing men. Which is actually kind of, so, and the census does count in basic counts. Sorry, yep.
What's that number? That's status Indians nationwide? First Nation, no.
Oh,
First
sorry.
Nation overall?
Oh yeah, so this is all First Nations people in the country in aggregate. So it means, so this is in First Nations communities, and this is counting everyone like in not First Nations communities. Okay? So what's interesting about this, so first of all, Indigenous men are more likely to be incarcerated, right? But the census actually does count. It doesn't ask a whole bunch of the questions you'd have in that census more generally, but it does include a basic count of gender and whether you're incarcerated. So incarcerations don't account for the fact that the gender ratio is lower than average. However, I do suspect it's a health issue. So Indigenous men, if they stay on reserve, may not have access to the same sort of medical care as Indigenous women that leave, okay? And I actually think that the fact that Indigenous women migrate out of these communities might be part of the cause of missing Indigenous men overall, all right? And I have some thoughts that I'm more than happy to share and talk to you about afterward, which me and Randy are intending to kind of move a bit forward on. How long do I have? All right, so I have till 10:15, okay. 7 big minutes. Oh no, I might have gone too fast. I get too excited. My students always tell me I talk too fast. I try to go slower, but not always successful. Okay, and I also just wanted to give you a sense that this is actually women leaving, not men coming to the reserves, right? This is a factor when we're talking about northern communities. In some northern communities, you have super skewed gender ratios, but it's because men are moving there for work in oil industry and stuff. So to kind of get a sense of this, what I did is I looked at from the 10 to 14 age category. I only have that category in 2006 and 2011. And I said, okay, did this cohort shrink in the next census, right? Is it smaller differentially for men and women? And we can see that for men on reserve, they leave. Men leave reserves as they get older. However, women leave at slightly higher rates, okay? And this is not the case for service centers or non-Indigenous communities. Okay, so it is actually people leaving, not men coming. Now, there's a lot of different types of migration or reasons you think you might migrate. One of which is economic opportunity, right? You want to go where the jobs are. And maybe there's more women's jobs off reserve than there are men's jobs, if you want to think it this way. So I do think that seems to be part of the story. However, these particular patterns here call into question whether it makes sense for all age groups, okay? So again, we have the gender ratio, and I've broken it down by 0 to 19 and 20 to 20 and 64. These are communities, Indigenous communities, that have no road access or over 370 kilometers away from the nearest service center, so nearest city or community. Or they're between 50 to 300 kilometers and within 50. So what I think is interesting about this pattern here is first, it's not statistically significant if you condition on a whole bunch of things like educational attainment of a community. However, you see that this 0 to 19 age group, if anything, it becomes more skewed as you get closer to a service center, right? So, and Indigenous communities closer to a service center, they tend to be larger and are more likely to have their own high schools, right? So they're not leaving for education. This is not what's going on here for this younger group, okay? This older group, maybe it's suggestive that outmigration for economic opportunity is actually what's going on, right? So as you're closer to a service center, you don't have to leave the reserve in order to find work, you can just commute, okay? So when we think about why we have these different skewed gender ratios in different age groups, I think it's really important to account that these are different types of people making decisions, perhaps for different reasons, okay? Okay. Now, you might just think, okay, well, women aren't really missing. Yeah, they're missing from their First Nations community, but we find them somewhere, right? If anything, we seem to find more women than we actually find men, so why does this really matter? And actually, I think there's a lot of reasons it matters, right? If you think about, so some communities, and not an insignificant number of them, have ratios where there's literally double the number of men than there are women. The dynamics in these communities are going to be very different than the dynamics in a community where you have a set of marriage partners, right? So firstly, the sex ratio within a community can affect bargaining power of the women there. If all the women that leave, so one thing you think, okay, low gender ratio, you might think women have more bargaining power and are treated better on reserve. However, if all the women that are most mobile move out, and the only women that stay are women that have very few outside options, their ability to be exploited is higher, okay? So partly this whole story of missing women in the news might be occurring because women are in a weakened position because they don't have other females around them to provide additional support, like the high educated matriarchs or whatever. In addition, previous literature has shown that too many single young men actually result in additional crime and prevalence of prostitution, transmission of sexual transmitted diseases, and just general changes in social structure. Okay? So even if we can, quote unquote, find the women missing from these communities, it doesn't mean it doesn't have a dramatic effect on dynamics in First Nations, right? So, and could also, again, one possible theory is it's part of what might be driving or worsening incarceration of Indigenous men is the absence of women in these communities. Yeah.
In the Amherst model, as you would sort of normally expect, scarcity means more bargaining.
Yeah, exactly.
How do you go from the first, why do you think this potentially reduced female bargaining?
So I do think so this is a good question. So I know that it goes in the reverse direction. So I think that generally it does increase female bargaining power. And I was thinking about it, and it would reduce Indigenous female bargaining power in the cities, right? Because there's an oversupply of Indigenous women if they want to marry Indigenous men, which you probably do to get status for your children, right? Incentives. The women here, I think it goes in two directions. I think it increases their bargaining power, but at the same time, since there's outmigration of high educated women, I think it allows women to be more exploited. So I think it's a more complicated story, but you're right. In the Angus model, obviously, higher sex ratio means you have more bargaining power. Yeah.
It seems like their models at the individual level, and if you bring in sort of at the social level, women have more sort of collective power, and that's that secondary force that I hear you.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So again,
Individual bargaining power and collective bargaining power.
yeah, they might be different. Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point. Yeah, so that's something that Randy and I have kind of been chatting about exactly how to write this down as a model and framework, because we think it's,
Sorry, I'm just following up.
yeah.
But then there's selection, what you.
Exactly.
There's the collective, kind of an external effect, but then there's also the selection issue.
Exactly.
With different types of women, and it's only,
Yeah.
highly educated, or there's a lot of outside options that are leaving.
Yeah.
Then you would get a similar effect because you would have adverse selection into state and reserve.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. You were about to say more. Your mouth opened, or no? No, not say more. Sorry, I don't want to pressure you into talking. Okay, great. All right, so I have less than a minute left, so that's fine. I'm basically done. So it's just me and Randy are going to be talking a little bit more about each of these possible factors. We're collecting data from ANSI on school presence, on reserve, and a number of other things I'm happy to talk about later if you are interested. I will not discuss this. The whole point of that was simply that most of this is being driven by smaller communities, right? So it tends to be in these small communities where this gender ratio is most important, okay? So in summary, this paper essentially lays the foundations for a broader research agenda on the well-being of women and men and how marriage potential plays into this, okay? We demonstrate that there is a large gender imbalance on Canadian First Nation reserves, and the skew begins in the age group 15 to 19. And this cannot fully be explained by gender bias in the Indian Act, and is likely due to differential migration, whether forced or not. What's next? We have just gotten access to the confidential data to do this, and really what we need to engage in next is a detailed counting exercise, look at migration, who's migrating, where are they going? So foster children has been brought up to me repeatedly about why women might be off reserve more than men, and its connection to missing women and missing men more generally. Thank you for your time and energy, and any questions would be great, or I guess discussion.
Yeah, let's just,
yes.